The Nebraska wind whispered through the tall grass, a lonely sound on the wide,
Eleanor!
flat land. For Eleanor Ward, the whisper seemed to echo the loneliness in her own heart. She stood on the porch of the small wooden house, her eyes scanning the homestead that had been her father's pride and joy. Now it felt like a giant, heavy burden placed squarely on her shoulders. Since her father's passing, the farm felt too big and too quiet. Every creak of the windmill and every chirp of a cricket only emphasized the silence. The barn roof had a sag that worried her. A section of the fence was crooked and needed to be reset. The thought of handling all of this alone, especially with winter coming, made her feel very small under the very big sky. One evening, after a long day of chores, she sat at the kitchen table with her well-worn Bible. She prayed for guidance, for help, for a solution. An idea came to her, a daring and unusual one. She would place an advertisement in a newspaper called the Matrimonial News. It was a paper where people looking for new beginnings could find each other. With a determined hand, she dipped her pen in ink and began to write. She asked for a sturdy, honest man who believed in God. She needed a partner who was not afraid of hard work or solitude. She was offering a marriage in name only, a partnership to save the farm she loved so much. Weeks later, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was neat and careful. The letter was from a man named Thomas Clark. His words were kind and thoughtful. He spoke of his faith and his willingness to work hard. He explained he had recently fallen on difficult times and had lost his money, but not his hope or his strength. He believed a fresh start on a Nebraska farm was exactly what he was looking for. His words felt genuine. After exchanging a few more letters, they agreed he would come. On the day he was to arrive, Eleanor put on her best calico dress. She hitched the old wagon to the horse and made the long trip into town to the Cedar Ridge train station. Her heart was a mix of nervousness and excitement. She pictured a respectable man, perhaps a bit down on his luck but clean and earnest, the kind of man whose handshake you could trust. She stood on the wooden platform, smoothing her dress nervously, waiting for the train to bring the answer to her prayers. She watched the horizon, eager to see the puff of smoke that would signal a change in her life. The world seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor Ward stood perfectly still on the sun-bleached wooden planks of the Cedar Ridge station platform, her hands clasped tightly in front of her best calico dress. The fabric, usually a comfort, now felt stiff and unfamiliar, a costume for a part she was no longer sure she knew how to play. The vast Nebraska sky, a brilliant and endless blue, arched above her, and the warm wind carried the dusty, familiar smells of hay and earth from the surrounding plains. But today, these familiar things felt different. They were the backdrop to a moment that was supposed to change everything. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. It was a feeling made up of equal parts wild hope and cold, clenching fear. She kept rehearsing the image in her mind, the picture she had painted from the careful, elegant words penned in Thomas Clark's letters. She imagined a man perhaps a few years older than herself, with a kind, tired face etched by recent hardship, but illuminated by a steadfast spirit. She pictured a suit that was worn but clean, brushed free of dust from the long journey, and shoes that, while perhaps scuffed, would be solid and respectful. He would step from the passenger car, grip a simple, sturdy valise, and scan the platform with a gaze that was both apprehensive and hopeful. Their eyes would meet. There would be a moment of silent understanding, a shared recognition of the strange, practical leap of faith they were both taking. Then he would walk toward her, tip his hat, and say in a voice that matched his letters, "Miss Ward, I am Thomas Clark. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance at last." This was the scene she had played out in her mind 100 times since his final letter had confirmed his arrival date. It was a scene that had sustained her through the last week of anxious waiting, through the sleepless night before, through the long, bumpy wagon ride into town. It was a prayer she had sent up over and over again, a silent plea that God would smooth the path for this unusual arrangement, that he would send her not just a worker, but a partner she could respect. A distant, mournful sound cut through the heavy air, pulling her from her thoughts. It was the whistle of the train, still far off but unmistakable. The sound sent a fresh jolt of nervous energy through her. She smoothed her dress for what felt like the 100th time, her palms slightly damp. She glanced around the platform, suddenly self-conscious. A few other townsfolk were waiting, their faces bored and accustomed to the daily ritual of the train's arrival. Mr. Higgins, The station master was perched on a stool outside his small office, chewing on a piece of straw and squinting down the tracks. He caught her eye and gave a slow, knowing nod. The whole town, it seemed, knew of Eleanor Ward's mail-order husband. News traveled faster than any locomotive in a place like Cedar Ridge. She felt her cheeks grow warm, and she fixed her gaze firmly on the empty iron rails, wishing she could simply blend into the wooden post behind her. The whistle blew again, closer this time, a shrill and commanding cry. Then came the deep, rhythmic chugging, a sound that grew from a faint rumble to a powerful, earth-shaking vibration that she could feel through the soles of her boots. A plume of black smoke appeared first, a dark smudge against the perfect blue, growing larger and denser. Finally, the engine itself rounded a distant curve, a great iron beast breathing fire and smoke, its single headlamp like an unblinking eye. It thundered into the station with a deafening roar of steam and grinding metal, the cars screeching and shuddering as the brakes were applied. The platform was suddenly engulfed in a hot, moist cloud of white steam and the acrid smell of coal smoke, so thick that for a moment, everything was obscured. Eleanor's heart hammered against her chest. This was it. The steam began to thin, curling away in the breeze. The passenger cars stood before her, their doors closed. She held her breath, waiting for one to open, for her future to step out. A conductor in a blue uniform hopped down onto the platform and placed a small step stool below one of the doors. He slid the door open and called out, "Cedar Ridge, 30-minute stop." The bored-waiting crowd stirred to life. A portly businessman in a suit was the first to descend, mopping his brow with a handkerchief and looking around with an expression of distaste. He was followed by a woman clutching the hands of two tired-looking children, a young man with a carpet bag, probably returning home from a trip east. A few other passengers disembarked, stretching their legs and blinking in the bright sunlight. Eleanor's eyes darted from face to face, her hope beginning to curdle into a sour anxiety. None of these people looked like her Thomas Clark. None of them were alone. None of them looked like they were arriving to stay. The flow of passengers stopped. The conductor glanced up and down the platform and then moved to close the door. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Eleanor. He wasn't here. There had been a mistake. He had changed his mind. He had missed the train. The disappointment was so sudden and so profound that she felt a physical ache in her chest. Her shoulders slumped. The carefully constructed image in her mind shattered into 1,000 pieces. But just as the conductor was about to signal to the engine, a movement caught her eye. It didn't come from the passenger cars. It came from further down the train, from one of the freight cars used for shipping cattle and crates. The large sliding door on one of these cars, covered in grime and faded graffiti, was pushed open from the inside with a rusty screech that grated on the air. A figure emerged from the dark interior of the freight car. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be him. This couldn't be anyone coming to meet someone. This was surely just a hobo, a drifter, jumping off in a new town to look for work or a handout. The man dropped down from the high floor of the freight car onto the gravel bed beside the tracks with a soft thud. He landed awkwardly, stumbling for a moment before righting himself. He was tall. She could see that much, but he was hunched over. His shoulders curled inwards as if he carried a great weight or was trying to make himself smaller. He turned and slowly, stiffly began to walk toward the platform, his steps heavy and weary. As he emerged from the shadow of the train and into the full, unforgiving light of the Nebraska sun, Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her, draining all the warmth from her body. This was not the man from the letters. This was a scarecrow given life, a portrait of utter destitution. His clothes were not merely old or worn. They were rags, a nightmare patchwork of poverty. His trousers were a faded brown, so thin they were almost translucent in places, and they were a good few inches too short, ending high above his ankles. They were patched at both knees with squares of a different, darker material, and one of these patches was itself coming loose, flapping faintly with his movement. His shirt had once been white, perhaps, but was now a grimed yellow-gray, torn at one elbow. It was missing 2 buttons, and the collar was frayed into a soft, limp mess. Over this, he wore a waistcoat that was so stained and shapeless it was impossible to tell its original color. It hung open. But it was his boots that were the most heartbreaking detail. They were cracked and ancient, the leather dried and crazed like a desert riverbed. The left boot had a gaping split along the seam that opened and closed with every step he took, revealing a glimpse of a dirty sock beneath. The sole on the right boot was completely detached from the toe to the arch, flapping like a tired mouth with a soft, pathetic sound against the platform boards as he walked. He had no suitcase, no valise, no parcel of any kind. His entire worldly possessions seemed to be contained in a burlap sack, the kind used for storing potatoes, which was slung over his shoulder. It looked limp and mostly empty. His face was shadowed by the wide brim of a battered hat, but she could see a wild, unkempt beard, thick and matted, covering the lower half of his face. What little skin was visible was etched with grime and the deep lines of what could only be profound exhaustion. He moved with a slow, deliberate care, as if every movement cost him a great effort. He was not heading toward the station house or the town. He was walking directly toward her. A hot wave of humiliation followed the cold dread. This could not be happening. This ragged, filthy specter could not be Thomas Clark. This was some cruel joke. She looked around wildly, hoping to see the real Thomas Clark emerging from the station master's office, apologizing for being late. But the platform was clearing. The other passengers had dispersed. The businessman was already hiring a cart. The family was walking toward the town. The man stopped a few feet in front of her. He smelled of coal smoke, of dust, of sweat, and of the deep, pungent odor of the freight car, a smell of animals and old wood and despair. He slowly, hesitantly raised his head. From under the shadow of his hat brim, she saw his eyes. They were a clear, startling blue, the only clean, bright thing about him. They were surrounded by a web of fine lines, and they held an expression of such deep, weary shame that it made her own heart twist. But within that shame, there was also a flicker of something else, a quiet, unutterable sadness and a resilience that seemed completely at odds with his appearance. There was a long, agonizing silence. The only sound was the hiss of the resting train engine and the soft, flapping splush, splush, splush of his broken boot sole. He opened his mouth to speak, and his voice, when it came, was low and raspy, as if from disuse, but it was undeniably educated, its tone gentle and formal. "Miss Eleanor Ward?" he asked. The sound of her name on his lips was the final confirmation. It was like a physical blow. She could not speak. She could only nod, a stiff, jerky motion of her head. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his grimy neck. "I am," he said, pausing as if the words were heavy stones he had to move. "Thomas Clark." He gave a slight, awkward bow from the waist, a gesture that might have been gentlemanly in another context, but here, in his devastating rags, seemed grotesque and pathetic. "I have arrived." Eleanor felt the world swim around her. The bright sky, the chuffing train, the curious stare of Mr. Higgins from his stool. It all blurred into a nauseating swirl. The man from the letters, the man of faith and thoughtful words, was this walking embodiment of failure, this pile of rags and sorrow. A desperate, furious thought screamed in her mind. "This is not the answer to my prayers. This is a mistake. God, how could you send me this?" She had prayed for a helper, a partner. She had been sent a beggar. Somehow, from some deep well of manners and sheer force of habit, she found her voice. It came out thin and strained, a stranger's voice. "Mr. Clark," she said. There was no welcome in it. Another silence descended, even more oppressive than the first. He seemed to be waiting for her to say something else, to offer some gesture of greeting. She could not. She could only stand there, frozen in her disappointment. Finally, he gestured weakly toward the end of the platform. I have my horse and wagon waiting," she managed to say, turning away from him, unable to look at him for another second. She started walking, her steps quick and angry on the wooden planks. She heard him follow, the clumsy, shuffling rhythm of his walk, the persistent, humiliating flap of that sole keeping a miserable tempo behind her. The journey to where she had hitched her old horse, Daisy, to the wagon felt like a walk of shame through a tunnel a mile long. She was acutely aware of every curtain twitching in every house they passed, every pair of eyes that might be watching the respectable Eleanor Ward walking with this creature. She felt a burning anger, at him for deceiving her with his letters, at herself for being so foolish and desperate, and at God for what felt like a monstrous betrayal. She reached the wagon. Daisy flicked her ears and whinnied softly. Eleanor didn't turn around. "You can put your things in the back," she said, her voice clipped and cold. She heard the soft thud of the burlap sack landing in the wagon bed. She climbed up onto the driver's bench, took the reins in her hands, and stared straight ahead. After a moment, she felt the wagon shift and creak as he hauled himself up onto the bench beside her. He sat as far to the edge as possible, as if trying to take up the least amount of space, to make himself as small and inconspicuous as he could. The smell of him, of travel and poverty, filled the space between them. Eleanor clicked her tongue and shook the reins. Daisy started forward with a lurch. The ride home was utterly silent. The sun beat down on them. The prairie stretched out on either side of the dirt road, beautiful and indifferent. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the clop of Daisy's hooves, the buzz of insects in the grass, and that terrible, rhythmic, flapping sound of his broken boot. Eleanor's mind was a storm of bitter thoughts. She thought of her father, of how he had worked so hard to build this farm. She thought of her own back-breaking labor to keep it going alone. She had risked everything, her reputation, her last bit of savings for his train fare, her very future, on the promises in those letters. And for what? For this man who looked like he could barely lift a spoon, let alone a bale of hay. What plans could God possibly have for this? It felt less like a divine plan and more like a cruel joke. She stole a single sideways glance at him. He was not looking at the land or the sky. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped. He was staring at his own hands, which were clasped in his lap. They were large hands, she noticed, the fingers long and capable looking, but they were as dirty as the rest of him, the nails broken and blackened. They looked like they had been desperately clawing at something. He held them perfectly still. In that moment, despite her anger and her humiliation, a tiny, unwanted prick of something else pierced her heart. It wasn't pity, not quite. It was the faintest recognition of a shared humanity. The posture of his body, the angle of his bowed head spoke of a shame so complete it was almost tangible. He knew. He knew exactly what she was thinking. He knew the depth of her disappointment. He had arrived carrying the heavy weight of it, a weight even heavier than the pathetic burlap sack in the wagon behind them. But that tiny prick was quickly smothered by the much larger, more immediate reality of her situation. She was now legally bound to this stranger. She had to take him home. She had to feed him. She had to give him a bed in her father's old bunkhouse. She had to introduce this ragged man to her neighbors as her husband. The hope that had filled her on the platform now felt like a foolish, distant dream. It had been replaced by a cold, hard knot of dread in the pit of her stomach. The future, which had seemed so bright with possibility just an hour ago, now stretched before her like a long, difficult, and deeply embarrassing road. She had asked God for a miracle. He had sent her a man in rags. And as the wagon rolled on, the only prayer left in her heart was a single desperate question, repeated over and over with the turning of the wheels. What do I do now? The silence in the wagon was a heavy, living thing. It sat between Eleanor and the ragged stranger on the seat, thick and suffocating, broken only by the steady clop of Daisy's hooves, the creak of the wooden wheels, and that terrible, rhythmic, flapping sound of his broken boot sole. Eleanor held the reins so tightly her knuckles were white bone against her skin. She stared straight ahead at the dusty ribbon of road unfurling across the prairie, but she saw nothing. Her mind was a whirlwind of scorching anger and icy despair. Each turn of the wheels carried them further from town, deeper into the isolation of her homestead, and deeper into the reality of her catastrophic mistake. The man beside her, Thomas Clark, kept his gaze fixed on his own dirty hands clasped in his lap. He seemed to be making himself as small as possible, shrinking into the ragged fabric of his clothes. The smell of him, of coal dust and sweat and something else, something like old sorrow, filled the air around them. Eleanor wanted to yell, to demand an explanation, to order him to get down and walk back to wherever he came from. But her pride and the crushing weight of her situation kept her mouth shut. She had made her bed, as the saying went, and now she had to lie in it. The thought made her shudder. After what felt like an eternity, the familiar outline of her homestead appeared on the horizon. The simple wooden house, the barn with its sagging roof, the crooked fence. It had always been her place of refuge, her Ather's dream made real. Now it felt like a stage set for a coming humiliation. She guided the wagon up the final stretch of the path and brought it to a halt in the yard. The silence stretched for another long moment after the sound of the wheels ceased. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice unnaturally crisp and formal, a shield against the emotions churning inside her. This is it. She did not look at him as she climbed down from the wagon bench, her movements stiff. He followed, moving slowly and stiffly, his movements those of a man much older than his years likely were. He stood in the yard, his burlap sack at his feet, and looked around. His clear blue eyes, the only part of him that seemed alive, took in the house, the land, the endless sky. For a fleeting second, Eleanor thought she saw a flicker of something in his gaze. Not judgment, not disappointment, but a kind of weary reverence. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same shuttered, resigned expression. "I will show you the bunkhouse," she said, turning on her heel and walking toward the small, separate building where her father had sometimes housed hired help. She pushed the door open. It was dusty and smelled of disuse, but it was clean. A simple cot stood against one wall with a thin mattress, a small wooden table and a single chair, and a washstand with a chipped ceramic pitcher and bowl. A single small window let in a square of afternoon light, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. "You can stay here," she said, still not meeting his eyes. "I will bring you some water and a blanket." He nodded, a simple, silent acknowledgement. He stepped inside, placing his meager sack on the floor beside the cot as if it contained precious glass. He seemed utterly defeated, a man who expected nothing and so was never disappointed. Eleanor turned and left, walking quickly back to the main house. She felt a confusing mix of relief to be away from him and a gnawing guilt for her own coldness. She fetched a pitcher of fresh water, a towel, and an old but clean blanket from a chest. When she returned to the bunkhouse, he was standing exactly where she had left him, as if he hadn't dared to move or touch anything. He took the items from her with a quiet "Thank you, ma'am," his voice that raspy, unused whisper. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange, disjointed haze. Eleanor busied herself with her usual chores, feeding the chickens, collecting the eggs, but her mind was elsewhere. She was acutely aware of his presence in the bunkhouse, a silent, unsettling shadow on her property. What was he doing in there? Was he sleeping? Was he just sitting on that cot staring at the wall? The not knowing was almost worse than knowing. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, she knew she had to face the next difficult task. She had to feed him. The practicality of it was undeniable. She couldn't let the man starve on her doorstep, no matter how furious she was. With a sigh of resignation, she prepared a simple supper of stew from the previous night and a thick slice of bread. She placed it on a tray and carried it out to the bunkhouse. She knocked softly on the door frame. "Supper," she called out. The door opened almost immediately. He had taken off his hat, and he had used the water to wash his face and hands. The transformation, while small, was startling. The grime was gone from his face, revealing skin that was tanned and weathered by sun and wind. His hair, a thick, unruly brown streaked with gray, was damp and combed back from his forehead. He looked cleaner, but the rags he still wore and the deep, tired lines around his eyes marked him clearly as what he was, a man who had fallen a very long way. "Thank you," he said again, taking the tray from her. His eyes met hers for a brief second, and in their blue depths, she saw a profound and unmistakable gratitude that shamed her. He was thanking her for a bowl of leftover stew. What kind of life had he been living? She nodded mutely and retreated back to the house, leaving him to his meal. She ate her own supper alone at the kitchen table, the silence in the house feeling louder than ever before. The next morning, Eleanor woke with a sense of dread. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, but it all felt like a mockery. She dressed and went outside to begin her day, half expecting to find that he had stolen away in the night, taking her blanket and pitcher with him. He had not. He was already outside, standing in the yard and looking up at the sagging roof of the barn. He had his back to her, and she stopped for a moment to watch him. He stood differently this morning, less hunched, his shoulders a little straighter. He was studying the roof with a keen, appraising eye, his head tilted. He must have sensed her presence, for he turned around. "Miss Ward," he said with a slight nod. "The ridge beam on the north side is cracked. That is why it sags. It needs to be braced before the next big wind, or it could come down." Eleanor blinked, surprised. She knew the roof was bad, but she hadn't known the specifics. I see," she said, unsure how else to respond. Without another word, he walked over to the small tool shed. He emerged a moment later with a hammer, a saw, and a few other tools. Then, to her utter astonishment, he began to move with a purpose she would not have thought him capable of. He found some scrap lumber piled behind the barn and began sorting through it, selecting a few sturdy-looking planks. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask for direction. He simply set to work. He hauled a rickety ladder from the side of the barn and propped it against the eaves. Then, with a quiet, focused energy, he climbed up. Eleanor stood rooted to the spot, her morning chores forgotten. She watched him, her initial skepticism slowly giving way to a grudging curiosity. He moved on the roof with a careful, practiced grace. He measured the plank, his large, dirty hands handling the saw with a confident precision. The rasp of the saw, the solid thump, thump, thump of his hammer, were sounds that had been absent from the farm for too long. He worked for hours, not stopping, not taking a break. The sun climbed higher, and sweat began to darken the back of his ragged shirt. Still he worked. He didn't just slap a board over the crack. He fashioned a clever, strong brace, fitting it perfectly to support the weakened beam. It was the work of someone who understood how things were put together, someone who had done more than just push a pen across paper. By mid-afternoon, the job was done. He climbed down from the ladder, his face streaked with new sweat and old dust. He looked up at his handiwork, a satisfied glint in his eye. The sag was still there. It would take more than a day to fix it completely, but it was noticeably less pronounced. It was secure. Eleanor found her voice. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. He simply nodded, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. "The hinge on the chicken coop is loose," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The pin is worn. I can forge a new one if you have the means." She just stared at him. He had noticed the chicken coop hinge? She had been meaning to fix it for months, propping the door closed with a rock every night. She simply pointed mutely toward the tool shed where her father's small, portable forge and anvil were stored. He spent the rest of the afternoon there, at the small forge. She heard the bellows wheeze and the clang of metal on metal. The rhythmic, solid sounds were a strange new music on the farm. He didn't emerge until evening, holding a new, hand-forged hinge pin, perfectly shaped. He went to the coop and in a few minutes had the door swinging smoothly and silently on its new pivot. Eleanor was dumbfounded. The man was a paradox. He arrived looking like he could barely lift his own head, but he worked with the strength and skill of 3 men. He spoke in the refined tones of an educated man, but his hands knew the language of manual labor. He was surrounded by an aura of profound shame, yet he carried himself with a quiet, unassuming dignity when he worked. Over the next few days, a new, uneasy routine established itself. Thomas Clark would rise early. He would perform his ablutions with the water she provided, and then he would simply find work. He didn't need to be told. He saw what needed doing as if the needs of the farm were written on the air. He fixed the handle on the water pump. He reset the crooked fence posts, digging the holes deep and packing the earth solid around them. He worked from sunup to sundown, stopping only for the simple meals she brought him. He never complained. He never asked for anything. He was always polite, always respectful, his "thank you, ma'am" a constant refrain. But he was also silent, an island of quiet industry in the middle of her land. The anger in Eleanor's heart did not disappear, but it could not remain pure and sharp in the face of such relentless, humble competence. It began to blur around the edges, mingling with confusion and a dawning, reluctant respect. The biggest test came on Sunday. The thought of taking this man, this walking embodiment of her poor judgment, to church in front of the entire congregation made her feel physically ill. She could already imagine the whispers, the sidelong glances, the pitying looks from Mrs. Gable, the smugness from Mr. Higgins. On Saturday evening, she went to an old trunk in her room. She opened it, and the scent of cedar and memory washed over her. Inside were her father's things. She pushed past his Sunday suit, too formal and too painful a memory, and found what she was looking for. A pair of sturdy brown trousers, a simple blue work shirt, a leather belt. They were his everyday clothes, worn but well made and clean. They had hung on his broad frame, and Thomas Clark looked to be of a similar size. She carried the small bundle out to the bunkhouse. He was sitting on the step, sharpening a hoe blade with a stone. He looked up as she approached. She thrust the clothes toward him, not meeting his eyes. "I cannot have you attending church in rags," she said, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. The words sounded cruel even to her own ears, but she didn't know how else to say it. He looked at the clothes in her hands, and for a moment a complex emotion flashed across his face. It was a mixture of shame, gratitude, and a deep, poignant sadness. He slowly reached out and took them. His fingers brushed against hers, and she felt the rough calluses that now covered his palms. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "This is a great kindness." The next morning, Eleanor dressed for church with a leaden heart. She walked outside, expecting to see him waiting in his same old rags, but he wasn't there. A moment later, the bunkhouse door opened. The man who stepped out was not the ragged scarecrow from the train station. Clean-shaven, he had shaved. The wild, matted beard was gone, revealing a strong, square jaw and a firm mouth. His hair, now clean and damp, was combed neatly. He wore her father's clothes. The trousers fit him well, and the blue shirt made his eyes seem even brighter. He stood up straight, his shoulders back, and he held his hat in his hands. He was not a handsome man in a conventional way. His face was too weathered, his expression too grave. But he looked respectable. He looked like a farmer. He looked like a man. He stopped a few feet from her, looking uncertain. "Will this be acceptable, Miss Ward?" he asked. Eleanor could only stare. The transformation was so complete it stole the breath from her lungs. This was the man from the letters. This was the quiet strength, the dignity, the intelligence she had imagined. It had been there all along, hidden under layers of grime and poverty and despair. A strange feeling stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt since he arrived. It wasn't love, and it wasn't even full trust. It was the first faint flicker of hope, small and fragile as a seedling, pushing its way up through the hard, frozen ground of her disappointment. She managed a small, stiff nod. "It is acceptable," she said, and for the first time, she almost believed it. The days that followed the Sunday church service settled into a new and peculiar rhythm on the Ward homestead. The sharp edge of Eleanor's anger had been blunted, not gone, but worn down by the relentless, quiet industry of Thomas Clark. He was like a steady, gentle rain that slowly erodes a stone. He did not try to make conversation or force his presence upon her. He simply worked. He was everywhere, a quiet force of repair and order. He mended tools Eleanor had thought were fit only for the scrap pile. He cleared the drainage ditch that ran along the north field, a backbreaking job she had been putting off for 2 seasons. He oiled the rusty pulley on the well. He worked with a focused economy of movement, never wasting a step or a motion. There was a deep intelligence to his labor, a sense that he was not just fixing things but understanding them, learning the language of her land and its needs. Eleanor watched him from a distance, her feelings a tangled knot she could not unpick. The man in her father's clothes, the man who stood straight and looked at her with those clear blue eyes, was so different from the broken creature who had stepped off the freight car. She found herself listening for the sound of his hammer, for the rasp of his saw. The farm itself seemed to sigh in relief under his care, the buildings standing a little straighter, the fields looking a little more orderly, yet a wall remained between them, built from her pride and his silent shame. They spoke only of practicalities. "The south pasture fence is weak," he would say over the supper she now shared with him at the small table in the yard, unable to bear eating alone in the house while he sat on the bunkhouse step. "I will look at it tomorrow," she would reply. Or she would say, "The pump is making a strange noise," and he would simply nod. "I heard it. I believe the washer is perished. I will see to it." Their conversations were a series of reports and acknowledgments, but in the spaces between the words something else was growing, a mutual respect, forged in the shared sweat of hard work and the silent appreciation of a job done well. Eleanor began to rely on the sound of his activity. It became the background music to her days, a promise that she was not alone in her struggle against the wilderness. Then the weather began to change. It started subtly. The sky, usually a vast clear blue, took on a hazy yellowish cast. The air, normally fresh and moving, became still and heavy, pressing down on the land with a damp, breathless weight. The birds fell silent. The animals grew restless. Daisy lowed nervously in her pasture, and the chickens clucked and fussed, sensing a shift in the world that humans could not yet perceive. Thomas noticed it first. He stopped his work on the afternoon of the 3rd day of strange weather, and stood for a long time, staring toward the western horizon. His brow was furrowed, his expression grim. "Something is coming," he said, his voice low. It was the first unsolicited thing he had said all day, Eleanor followed his gaze. The sky to the west was a peculiar shade of green, like tarnished brass. "A summer storm," she said, trying to sound unconcerned. "We get them. It will blow over." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "Not like this. This feels different. We should prepare." A prickle of unease traced its way down Eleanor's spine. There was a certainty in his tone that brooked no argument. Without another word, they began to move with a new urgency. They secured tools in the shed. They tied down the tarpaulin over the woodpile. They herded the chickens into their coop, and Thomas made sure the new hinge was fast and the latch was strong. The greenish tint of the sky deepened. The air grew even heavier, so thick it was difficult to breathe. The first breath of wind arrived, not a refreshing breeze, but a hot, fitful gust that kicked up dust devils in the yard and rattled the shutters on the house. It died away as quickly as it came, leaving an even deeper silence in its wake, a silence that felt like a held breath. Then they heard it. A distant rumble, not like the familiar thunder of a prairie storm, but a deeper, continuous roar, like 1,000 wagons racing across the heavens. Thomas's head snapped up. "Get inside the house now!" His voice was sharp, commanding. It was not a suggestion. Eleanor, for once, did not hesitate. She ran for the house, her heart hammering. She had just reached the porch when the world exploded. The wind hit like a physical wall. It screamed around the corners of the house, a furious living thing. The sky, now a violent, swirling blackish green, opened up, but it was not rain that fell first. It was hail, stones of ice, some as large as hens' eggs, pelted down from the sky with a terrifying force. They hammered against the roof, shattered the glass of the kitchen window, and tore the leaves from the plants in Eleanor's small garden. She stood frozen in her doorway, watching the devastation. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of shrieking wind, pounding hail, and crashing thunder that rolled without ceasing. Through the chaotic curtain of ice and rain, she saw Thomas. He was not running for shelter. He was fighting his way toward the barn, his head down against the stinging hail, his body leaning into the gale. He was going to check on the larger animals, on Daisy and her calf and the old plow horse Samson. Her fear for him was a sharp, cold knife in her chest. "Thomas," she screamed, but her voice was ripped away by the wind, a meaningless whisper in the storm's fury. She lost sight of him as he yanked open the barn door and disappeared inside. The hail began to mix with slashing horizontal rain, reducing visibility to a few feet. The world had shrunk to the desperate space between her door and the howling chaos outside. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The storm did not abate. It intensified. The wind seemed to be trying to pry the very boards from her house. Then a new sound cut through the din, a sound that turned her blood to ice. It was a sharp, explosive crack, louder than any thunderclap. A sound of something immense and solid being broken in two. It was followed by a great groaning, tearing crash that shook the ground beneath her feet. Eleanor stared in horror through the broken window. The ancient oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of the property, the tree her father had loved, was now a monstrous silhouette against the flickering lightning. A massive limb, a branch as thick as a man's body, had been sheared off by the wind. It was falling, spinning in a deadly arc and crashing down directly onto the roof of the barn. The sound of splintering wood was horrific. The branch did not just land. It smashed through the roof, and for a single heart-stopping second, there was a shower of sparks. The lightning strike had not just broken the tree, it had set the branch on fire. And now that burning missile was embedded in the dry, tinder-dry wood of the barn roof. Smoke began to billow, thick and black, fighting against the slashing rain. The animals. Thomas. A pure, primal terror seized Eleanor. Without thought for her own safety, she yanked a heavy wool blanket from a chest by the door, threw it over her head, and ran out into the maelstrom. The wind tried to knock her off her feet. Hail stung her face and hands. She fought her way toward the barn, her feet slipping in the churning mud. The scene before her was something from a nightmare. The barn roof was on fire, the flames licking greedily at the old wood, fighting the rain and winning. The hole where the branch had struck was a gaping maw of fire and smoke. And from inside she could hear it. The frantic, terrified screaming of Daisy the cow. She was trapped. "Thomas!" Eleanor screamed again, her voice raw with panic, and then she saw him. Through the smoke pouring from the barn door, a figure emerged. It was Thomas, coughing, staggering, his face blackened with soot. He saw her and his eyes widened in alarm. "Get back!" he roared, his voice somehow carrying over the storm. But he didn't come toward her. He turned and plunged back into the burning, smoke-filled barn. "No," Eleanor shrieked. She started forward, but a blast of heat and smoke forced her back. She could only stand there, helpless, watching the entrance, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails cut into her palms. The seconds dragged by, each one in agony. The fire was spreading, crawling along the roof beams. The entire structure groaned, a death rattle. Just as she thought she would scream from the terror of it, he emerged again. This time he was half crawling, half dragging. He had a rope in his hands, and on the end of it, wild-eyed with fear, was Daisy. He was pulling the terrified animal toward the door, yanking with all his might against her panic. They stumbled out into the yard just as a central beam inside the barn gave way with a final, groaning shriek. There was a tremendous crashing roar as a large section of the roof collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks and burning embers shooting into the stormy sky. Thomas threw himself and the cow clear, collapsing into the mud a safe distance away. Daisy, freed, bolted for the far pasture, bellowing in fear. The storm raged on, but for Eleanor everything had narrowed to the man lying motionless in the mud. The rain began to fall harder, hissing as it hit the burning barn, slowly beating the fire down into a smoldering ruin. "Thomas," she cried, scrambling through the mud to his side. She fell to her knees beside him. He was lying on his back, his chest heaving, coughing great racking coughs that shook his whole body. His clothes were soaked and smoldering, his face and arms blackened with soot and ash. The new clothes, her father's clothes, were ruined, scorched and torn, but he was alive. His eyes were open, staring up at the raging sky, and in them she saw not fear, but a fierce, triumphant light. He turned his head and looked at her. His voice, when it came, was raspy from the smoke, but it was calm, steady, and utterly sure. "She is safe," he said. Tears, warm and mingling with the cold rain on her face, streamed down Eleanor's cheeks. They were tears of relief, of terror, of an overwhelming, crashing wave of emotion. She reached out a trembling hand and placed it on his arm, needing to feel that he was real, that he was solid. You could have been killed," she whispered, her voice breaking. He slowly, painfully pushed himself up to a sitting position. He looked at the burning, collapsed ruin of her barn, at the saved cow standing shivering in the distant field, and finally at her. His soot-streaked face was serene. "For what is given to our care," he said quietly, his words clear even through the fading storm. "We must sometimes risk much." In that moment, kneeling in the mud and the rain beside the smoldering wreckage of her barn, everything changed. The image of the ragged scarecrow, the bitter disappointment, the wall of pride and anger, it all crumbled to ash, blown away by the storm's fury. She did not see a beggar. She did not see a failure. She saw the strongest, bravest man she had ever known. She saw a courage that was not about lack of fear, but about action in spite of it. She saw a man who valued the life of a simple farm animal above his own safety. She saw the answered prayer she had been too blind to recognize. The mail-order husband had arrived in rags, but the man who had just run into a burning building was clothed in something far greater, something unbreakable. And for the first time, Eleanor began to understand that God's plans were not about sending her what she wanted, but what she truly needed. The world was reduced to the hiss of rain on hot embers and the ragged sound of their breathing. Eleanor knelt in the churned, muddy earth, her hand still resting on Thomas's arm. She could feel the solid muscle beneath the scorched fabric of his sleeve, the tremors of exertion and adrenaline that ran through him. The storm was passing as quickly as it had arrived, the furious wind softening to a sigh, the lightning retreating to a distant grumble over the eastern plains. In its wake it left a scene of utter devastation. The barn was a blackened, skeletal ruin. Smoke and steam rose from the collapsed roof in thick gray plumes, carrying the bitter, acrid smell of burnt wood and wet ash into the cleansed air. The great limb of the oak tree, a monstrous charcoal black spear, was buried deep within the wreckage. Around them, the yard was a quagmire of mud and scattered hailstones that glittered like diamonds in the patches of emerging sunlight. Her garden was pummeled into the ground, the kitchen window a gaping, jagged hole. But none of that mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the man sitting beside her in the mud. Tears continued to trace clean paths through the rain and soot on Eleanor's face. The fear that had iced her veins was now a thawing river of relief and a profound shaking awe. She looked at Thomas, Truly looked at him, seeing past the grime and the rags and the quiet exterior for the very first time. "Can you stand?" she asked, her voice husky with emotion. He nodded, and with her help, he pushed himself to his feet. He swayed slightly, a fresh cough racking his chest. "The animals," he said, his first concern not for himself, but for the stock that had been in the barn stalls. "Samson got out," Eleanor said, pointing to the far field where the old plow horse was already grazing as if nothing had happened. "And Daisy is over there. The chickens are safe." She hesitated. "You saved her, Thomas. You saved Daisy." He followed her gaze to where the cow stood, still trembling but unharmed. A look of deep satisfaction crossed his battered features. "Good," he said simply. "That is good." The practicalities of survival began to reassert themselves. They were both soaked to the skin and shivering. Thomas's clothes were ruined, and he was likely injured. "Come inside," Eleanor said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It was not a suggestion or a polite offer. It was a command born from a new, fierce protectiveness. "You need to get warm and dry." "We need to see to your burns," he did not protest. He allowed her to lead him, stumbling slightly with weariness, into the house. She guided him to the chair by the hearth, the one her father had always favored. She stoked the embers of the fire and added new wood until a warm, cheerful blaze began to crackle and push back the damp chill in the room. She brought a basin of warm water and clean cloths. "Your hands and arms," she instructed gently. He held out his hands. The backs were red and blistered from the heat, and there were several small cuts. He had not even noticed. As she began to gently clean the soot and tend to the minor burns, a silence fell between them. But it was a different silence than before. The cold, angry wall that had separated them was gone, shattered by the events of the storm. In its place was a quiet, shared understanding, a raw vulnerability. Eleanor worked methodically, her mind racing. The questions that had festered for weeks now rose to the surface, not with anger, but with a desperate need to understand. The man who had written those elegant letters and the man who had arrived in rags were one and the same. The man who could barely meet her eyes and the man who had run into a burning building were one and the same. The disconnect was too vast, the paradox too great to ignore any longer. When she had done what she could for his injuries, she sat down in the chair opposite him. The firelight played over his tired face, highlighting the lines of exhaustion and the clean places where her cloth had wiped away the grime. He watched the flames, his expression unreadable. "Thomas," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I need to understand." He did not look at her, but he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod as if he had been expecting this, waiting for it. "Your letters," she continued. "They were so educated, so thoughtful. You wrote about books and faith and—" She gestured vaguely at the room, at him. "This, the man who arrived." He was so broken. "And the man who just ran into that fire." Her voice trailed off, the question hanging in the air between them, more powerful for being unspoken. "Who are you?" Thomas took a long, slow breath. He finally turned his head to look at her, and in his blue eyes she saw the ghost of that same shame she had seen on the first day. But it was now mixed with a weary resolve. The time for hiding was over. "The letters were true," he said, his voice low and raspy from the smoke. "Every word. I was a clerk. I worked in a small office in St. Louis. I handled ledgers, correspondence, legal documents. My world was made of ink and paper and words." He gave a faint, sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I loved words. I loved the order they could bring. I had a small house, a good life. Or so I thought." He paused, gathering himself, his gaze returning to the fire as if he could see the past dancing in the flames. Then came the fire. It started in the building next to mine, a warehouse. It was late at night. The wind was high. His voice grew even quieter, detached, as if he were recounting a story about someone else. It spread so quickly. There was nothing anyone could do. I stood in the street and watched it burn. I watched my office, my books, everything I had worked for. Everything I was turned to ash and smoke. It took the building next, my home. I escaped with nothing but the clothes I was sleeping in. Eleanor listened, her heart aching. She could see it, the terrible scene unfolding in her mind. The roaring inferno, the helplessness, the utter devastation. For weeks afterward, he continued, I was like a ghost. I stayed in a boarding house relying on the charity of friends. I tried to find work, but what use as a clerk with no references, no presentable clothes, no home? My suit, the one I had left, became worn and dirty. I patched it until it could not be patched anymore. I sold my watch for food. I became that man you saw, the man in rags. He looked down at his hands, at the new bandages she had wrapped around them. The shame was a heavier burden than the hunger. I had been a man of some standing, and I was reduced to nothing. I was too proud to beg, but too poor to do anything else. I lived in that freight car for a month, traveling from town to town looking for any kind of work, any chance to start over. He finally looked back at her, his gaze direct and raw. When I saw your advertisement, it felt like a lifeline. I answered to a prayer I had been too proud to speak. Here was a chance for honest work, a roof, a purpose. I wrote to you with the last of my hope. I used the last of my money for paper and a stamp. I believed that if I could just get here, I could prove my worth with my hands, since I had nothing else left to give. He took another shaky breath. The man who wrote those letters was who I was. The man who arrived on your platform was what was left of me after the world had burned away everything else. I believed, I have to believe, that God allowed me to be stripped of all that pride, all that former life, so that I could arrive here empty, ready to be filled with a new purpose, ready to work without any arrogance, ready to be of use. The silence that followed was deep and profound, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Eleanor felt her own tears welling up again, but they were tears of a different kind. They were tears of shared sorrow, of understanding, of a shame that was now her own for having judged him so harshly. She had seen a beggar. But he was not a beggar. He was a survivor. She had seen a man broken by misfortune, but he was not broken. He had been refined by it, forged in a fire far hotter than the one that had just consumed her barn. He had lost everything, not just his possessions, but his identity, his place in the world, and yet he had held on to his core, his faith, his willingness to work, his fundamental decency. He had arrived with nothing, but he had brought everything that truly mattered. She thought of his quiet industry, his skillful hands, his gentle way with the animals, his unwavering courage. These were not the traits of a broken man. These were the foundations of a great man. Thank you, she whispered. The words inadequate, but all she had. Thank you for telling me. He gave a small, weary nod. Thank you, he replied, for not turning me away, for giving me a chance. Outside, the sun broke fully through the retreating clouds, sending beams of golden light through the broken window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The storm was over. The truth was out. And in the warm, quiet kitchen, something new and fragile and strong began to grow in the space where the silence used to be. It was the beginning of understanding. It was the first real foundation of trust. The truth, once spoken, settled over the homestead like the clean, rain-washed air after the storm. It did not magically erase the challenges they faced. The barn was still a blackened ruin. The garden was destroyed. The kitchen window was a gaping hole. But the landscape between Eleanor and Thomas had been fundamentally and forever altered. The invisible wall was gone, and in its place was a vast open space of possibility, waiting to be filled not with silence but with shared purpose. The next morning, they stood side by side in the yard, looking at the wreckage of the barn. The smell of wet charcoal was strong. It was a daunting sight, a monument to loss. But for the first time, Eleanor did not feel the cold grip of solitary despair. She felt the solid, quiet presence of the man beside her, and it was a tangible strength. We will need to clear it first, Thomas said, his voice practical. His eyes were already assessing, planning. We can salvage some of the timbers. The stone foundation is still good. The word hung in the air between them, simple and powerful. It was no longer her farm. It was theirs to rebuild, and so they began. The work was backbreaking. They started by hauling away the charred and splintered remains of the roof piece by piece. The air was filled with the sound of their labor, the scrape of shovels, the thud of burnt wood being tossed onto a growing pile, the rasp of saws cutting through damaged beams. They worked in sync, their movements becoming a wordless conversation. Eleanor would struggle with a heavy piece of debris, and Thomas would be there to take the other end without a word. He would need a tool, and she would have it ready, anticipating his need. They spoke now, their conversations no longer just reports, but plans and ideas. What if we build the new roof with a steeper pitch? Thomas suggested one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. It would shed the snow better in winter. Eleanor nodded, considering. We could use the good lumber from the old south fence for the supports. It's seasoned and strong. They were partners. True partners. The respect that had been growing slowly now blossomed into a deep and mutual admiration. Eleanor marveled at Thomas's practical intelligence, his ability to see a solution hidden within a problem. Thomas, in turn, was in awe of Eleanor's resilience, her knowledge of the land, and the fierce determination that had kept this farm alive against all odds. Their days fell into a new rhythm. They rose with the sun and worked until the light faded. Eleanor would prepare meals, and they would eat together at the small table in the yard. Their talk filled with the day's progress and the next day's plans. The simple food tasted better shared. The exhaustion at the end of the day was a satisfying ache, a testament to what they had accomplished together. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold, Thomas began to talk more about his life before. Not about the fire, but about the good things. He spoke of his love for reading, of his favorite books of history and philosophy. He told her a funny story about a mischievous dog that used to visit his office. Eleanor found herself laughing, a real, genuine laugh that felt foreign and wonderful on her lips. She shared stories of her father, of his dreams for this land, of the struggles and joys of her childhood here. The past was no longer a separate country for each of them. It was becoming a shared map, helping them to understand each other's terrain. Their faith, which had always been a quiet, personal thing, became a shared cornerstone. Each morning before they began their work, they would pause. Thomas would read a passage from her father's old Bible, his voice low and respectful. Eleanor would then say a prayer, not just for strength or for a good harvest, but for guidance in their partnership, for wisdom in their decisions, for a continued spirit of cooperation. It was a daily reaffirmation of the purpose they were building together, a recognition that their strength came not just from themselves, but from a shared source of grace. Weeks turned into a month. The pile of ash and ruin was replaced by the clean, strong lines of a new foundation and the rising skeleton of new walls. The farm was not just being repaired, it was being improved. Thomas designed a new layout for the barn that was more efficient. Eleanor suggested a better location for the rainwater collection barrel. They were not just rebuilding what was lost. They were building something new, something better, something that was a product of both their minds and both their hearts. The change was noticed in town. When they went for supplies, people no longer looked at them with pity or curiosity. They saw a team. They saw Eleanor standing a little taller, her face no longer pinched with worry but alight with purpose. They saw Thomas no longer a ragged stranger but a capable, quiet man who had clearly earned his place. Mr. Higgins at the station even tipped his hat to them. Mrs. Gable from the church commented on how well the farm was looking. One afternoon, they were fitting a new support beam into place. It was heavy, and required both their strength and concentration to maneuver it into the precise notch Thomas had carved. They pushed and guided, their muscles straining until with a final solid thud it slid perfectly into place. They stood back, breathing heavily to admire their work. The beam was straight and true, a strong backbone for their new barn. Without thinking, Eleanor turned to Thomas, a wide, triumphant smile on her face. "We did it," she said, her voice full of joy. Thomas looked back at her, and for the first time since his arrival, a real, full smile broke across his face. It transformed him, lighting up his blue eyes and easing the weary lines around them. "We did," he agreed, his voice warm. In that moment, standing in the frame of the barn they were building together, surrounded by the evidence of their shared labor, something shifted again. The partnership, the friendship, the deep respect, it all coalesced into a new and startling clarity. Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun on her back. She saw the way he looked at her, not with gratitude or deference, but with a fondness that mirrored her own feelings. The marriage of convenience, the practical arrangement she had proposed, felt like a distant memory. The legal paper they had signed was a hollow shell compared to the real, living, breathing partnership they had forged with their own hands. They had started with a transaction, but they were building a life. They had begun as strangers, but they had become each other's closest ally, each other's most trusted confidant. The new dream was no longer just about saving a farm. It was about building a future, and as they stood there in the golden light of the afternoon, surrounded by the sounds of their own making, the future had never looked more bright or more full of promise. The foundation was laid not just for a barn, but for something infinitely more permanent. The new barn stood as a testament to their shared labor, its fresh pale wood gleaming in the sun, a stark and proud contrast to the memory of the charred ruin that had once been there. It was stronger than the old one, better designed, and as they put the final coat of protective stain on its walls, Eleanor felt a swell of pride that was entirely new. It was not just her accomplishment or his. It was theirs. The entire farm seemed to hum with a new vitality, a reflection of the harmony that had grown between its caretakers. The seasons turned, the fierce heat of summer giving way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The land offered up its bounty, and they worked side by side to bring in the harvest. They gathered vegetables from the replanted garden, stored hay in the loft of the new barn, and prepared for the winter that was whispering on the horizon. The work was still hard, the days still long, but the solitude that had once haunted Eleanor was now a distant memory. It had been replaced by a comforting companionship, a sense of shared purpose that made every task feel lighter. Evenings were now the best part of the day. After supper, they would often sit together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast velvet sky. They talked of everything and nothing. They spoke of their hopes for the spring, of maybe adding a few more sheep to the flock, of repairing the front porch steps. Thomas would sometimes read aloud from a book, his voice a calm, steady rhythm that Eleanor had come to love. She found herself sharing her own thoughts and dreams, things she had never voiced to another living soul. He listened, truly listened, his attention a gift she cherished. One such evening, the air was particularly clear and cool. A full moon hung over the prairie, bathing the world in a soft, silvery light. The harvest was in. The stores were full. The farm was sleeping peacefully. They sat in a comfortable silence, wrapped in the quiet beauty of the night. Eleanor looked at Thomas, really looked at him in the moonlight. She saw the man who had arrived in rags, hollowed out by loss. She saw the man who had worked with quiet determination to repay her kindness. She saw the hero who had fearlessly run into a burning building, and she saw the partner who had stood by her side ever since, building a new life from the ashes of their old ones. Her heart felt so full it ached. Thomas was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the moon-washed fields. Then he turned to her. The usual calmness in his blue eyes was replaced with a tender seriousness that made her breath catch. "Eleanor," he began, his voice softer than usual. "When I first arrived here, I believed I was the answer to your advertisement. A worker, a pair of hands. I thought that was all I had to offer, and I was grateful for the chance to offer it." He paused, choosing his words with the same care he used to choose the right tool for a job. "But God had other plans. He didn't just bring me here to mend your fences and raise your barn. He brought me here to find you." He reached over and gently took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, a permanent record of their labor, but his touch was incredibly gentle. "This marriage began as a convenience," he said, his eyes holding hers. "A contract on a piece of paper. But my heart has signed a different contract altogether. I have come to not only respect you, Eleanor, but to love you, deeply and truly." He took a breath, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I know this was not what you originally agreed to, but I must ask, would you consider making this a real marriage? Not one of convenience, but one of love? Would you do me the greatest honor of my life and be my true wife?" Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She did not need to think. She did not need to consider. The answer had been growing in her heart for months, as naturally and inevitably as the crops in their fields. She turned her hand in his, lacing her fingers through his. Her smile was radiant, brighter than the moon above them. "Thomas Clark," she said, her voice clear and full of emotion, "that piece of paper was the least of our promises. We have already built a real marriage. We built it with every nail we hammered, every seed we planted, every prayer we said together. My answer is yes. 1,000 times yes." The relief and love that blossomed on his face was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of old-fashioned reverence that made her heart soar. And there, under the endless Nebraska sky, surrounded by the land they had healed and that had, in turn, healed them, the mail-order husband and his wife began their true life together. They had started with nothing but a desperate hope and a prayer. God, in his infinite wisdom, had indeed had other plans. He had taken a man in rags and a woman in loneliness, and had woven them into a tapestry of love, faith, and partnership, more beautiful than anything either could have imagined. Their story was not about how they had found each other, but about how they had built something lasting together, and they knew, with a certainty as deep as the prairie soil, that their harvest of happiness was only just beginning. The end.